Hi everyone, Professor Philip Travis here, and this is our last week here for History 112, World History 1400 to the present, here at Eastern Oregon University. This week, we're going to be reading chapter 29 and 30 from our textbook. There's also a documentary film, and I think you're going to find the documentary film very interesting. It's a recent documentary film, and it relates to part of our topic this week, and you'll also notice that discussing this film is part of this week's discussion forum. So our subject for this week is the Cold War and globalization, and also decolonization. So the Cold War, decolonization, and globalization. So the Cold War, of course, refers to that global competition and standoff between the United States, representing democratic capitalism, the Soviet Union representing authoritarian communism, competing and vying for influence in the world as global superpowers. The Cold War lasted roughly from 1947 until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, and there are still many tensions and legacies from the Cold War today. The Cold War was associated with nuclear arms races. The Soviet Union and the United States both had, by the 1970s, somewhere in the realm of 30,000 nuclear warheads. And these were now nuclear warheads that were not going to be dropped from the rather primitive bombers of the Second World War, but rather ones that were affixed to ballistic missiles that could be medium range, intermediate range, short range, or intercontinental. And these types of weapons could be launched from land-based silos. They could be launched from submarines that are patrolling the waters at all times. By the 1970s and 80s, they even had multiple warheads on each missile so that one missile could target something like 8 different targets. That was a huge element of the Cold War. And one of the ones that really concerned many specialists, policymakers, scientists, professors, and so forth in the world, because for the first time in human history, humans truly had the capacity to effectively annihilate human civilization. And I think one of the biggest concerns over that, too, was the fear that a small conflict or an accident could escalate into a thermonuclear war. And that became one of the really big focal points of the Cold War. And eventually the efforts by people like Mikhail Gorbachev in the Soviet Union and Ronald Reagan to begin nuclear arms reductions, and also Richard Nixon and Leonid Brezhnev in the Soviet Union, who developed treaties like the SALT Treaty and the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. These were huge developments as the United States and the Soviet Union saw this danger and started to work to reduce the amount of these arms. Nuclear arms and nuclear arms race is a huge element of the Cold War. Another aspect of the Cold War was decolonization. Decolonization was the process whereby all of the former colonized territories, if you remember going back to our discussion of 19th century imperialism, European powers particularly the British and the French more than any others, but not only them, of course, the United States had colonies. The Philippines was a colony of the United States. After World War II, all of those colonies that countries, Western European countries, had created in Africa, in South Asia, in Southeast Asia, and the informal sort of imperial countries, imperialized countries of places like Latin America too. In the aftermath of the Second World War, these places all sought to vie for true, legitimate independence. And this is the process of decolonization. And the process of decolonization was mixed. In some areas, it was a smooth transition to independence in countries and places like Africa. In other areas, it resulted in devastating and catastrophic civil conflicts. The French war in Algeria, North Africa, was one of the notorious. The French and then the American war in Vietnam, the Vietnam War, was one of the most notorious examples of a decolonization conflict with massive, devastating consequences. So we're going to look at the Cold War. We're going to look at the conflicts in the developing world associated with decolonization, as the United States and the Soviet Union were usually involved either directly or indirectly in those conflicts in the developing world, because as the old empires fell apart, as the old empires crumbled and these new countries tried to gain true independence, the United States and the Soviet Union naturally filled the vacuum and sought to shape the future of those countries to be either American friendly or Soviet communist friendly. And so the Cold War is this global standoff between capitalism, democratic capitalism, authoritarian communism. It involves nuclear arms, it involves wars across the developing world as the United States and the Soviet Union vie for global hegemony, global power in the world. From the period at the very end of the Second World War, 45 to 47, historians debate the exact start date, until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. And we live with many legacies of this. And that's part of our discussion for this week. Another part of our discussion this week is globalization. And globalization is kind of a hot button political term these days, but it's a very old historical term. When historians use globalization as a term, historians are basically referring to the process of how the world became globally interconnected. World historians, when they look and study history, world historians would argue that historical change globally is driven most by interconnections, that global interconnectivity is the driver of world historical change. The Black Death, if we go back to the late Middle Ages, the Black Death was an example of something that was globally interconnected. Started in Asia, went across trade routes, came ultimately through merchants to Sicily, up to Italy, and through Western Europe. And the Black Death, because of that globally interconnected nature, fundamentally reshaped cultures all over the world, and certainly in Western Europe. So globalization is a long historical subject for historians. Most historians would chart globalization from the incorporation of the Americas, the Columbian Exchange, and particularly when silver from the Bolivian mine in the old Inca Empire, Potosi, began to flood the global sort of currency exchange. And by 1571, silver had effectively become the first true global currency, moved throughout the world by Spanish galleons. So many historians would say globalization begins around 1571, even if today it is an often politicized term. But today, globalization is at a faster, more rapid pace than ever before. The world is more interconnected than it's ever been before. So many products that people use and buy and consume are globally connected in terms of labor, in terms of resources, and in terms of manufacture and marketing. It's all globally connected. And of course, in the coronavirus pandemic that began in 2020, we of course can also see how interconnected the world is, and this is all really an evidence of the fast-paced nature of globalization in the 21st century. So we're going to look at globalization. So real quick, because I'm making this kind of long. If you have not written a paper yet in this class, the paper 2 option is due Tuesday of next week. That's Tuesday of exam week. So Tuesday of next week, the paper 2 option will be due. Please take a look at the prompt. Make sure you follow the guidelines. I want footnotes in Chicago style. I want 3 different academic resources. Make a specific argument. If you haven't written a paper, make sure you write that paper. You don't want to wind up having a 0 for a paper grade. If you've written a paper and you're happy with your score, you don't have to worry about that. So it is optional as long as you've already written one. If you haven't written one, you need to write the second paper, which is due Tuesday of exam week. Your third test is due on Sunday. The study guide is up. Make sure you use that study guide, be able to identify those terms, and that study guide is up. The test is due Sunday. I will have the test available and ready for you to take no later than Tuesday by midnight. So I want to make a few little changes to kind of emphasize things that we've been emphasizing in the course this term. I like to change the test every term. So make sure that you study for that test. It'll be up no later than Tuesday by midnight, and I would recommend studying, preparing, and taking it towards the end of the week so that you're as prepared as you can possibly be. The factoid for this week, remember, send me this email no later than Wednesday by midnight. Get that bonus point added towards the test score at the end of the term, which is right upon us. The fact is this: the Vietnam War, even though the United States was not trying to colonize the Vietnam War was a product of decolonization. The French had colonized Vietnam. The Vietnamese communists, led by Ho Chi Minh, at the end of World War II in 1945, declared independence, and the French and the Vietnamese began to fight over the fate of this former French colony. This developed into the French Indochina War. The French Indochina War, the French were ultimately defeated by the Vietnamese communists led by Ho Chi Minh, the Viet Minh, and Vo Nguyen Giap in 1954, the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. The United States took over to try to create a southern government, a South Vietnamese government that could stand against communism, as the United States thought to contain communism globally. And this developed ultimately into the American Vietnam War, which was, for the United States, a war to contain communism. But for Ho Chi Minh and the Vietnamese communists from North Vietnam particularly, this was a war for the independence of Vietnam. Vietnam had suffered colonialism, imperialism for years, and this was, for them, a war about independence. For them, it was more of a civil war and a national struggle. The factoid is this: in its efforts to contain communism from spreading to South Vietnam and abroad, the United States dropped more bombs in terms of tonnage than all theaters of World War II combined. So in its efforts to contain communism in South Vietnam from spreading to South Vietnam and abroad, the United States dropped more tons of bombs in the areas in and around South Vietnam than all theaters of World War II combined. Let's have a great week, everyone. It's been a great class. Really enjoyed having you in the class. I hope to see some of you in my future classes. So I'll see you in the discussion forum. Let me know if you have any questions.